Saturday night, a Dublin back kitchen, sometime in the 1700s. A pot sits on a low fire, barely a flame underneath it. Inside is whatever the week left behind. The blunt ends of a few sausages, the fatty edges of bacon nobody wanted to throw out, an onion, a handful of potatoes, a jug of water, and nothing else. There is no browning, no searing, almost no fuel burning under any of it. By morning the whole family has eaten, and it cost close to nothing. They called it Coddle. People will tell you this dish is ancient, that it is medieval Irish cooking, handed down unbroken for 1,000 years, a taste of the Middle Ages still alive on the modern table. So how does a meal everyone calls medieval lean on a vegetable that did not even reach Ireland until the late 1500s? That one question is the whole story. Coddle is younger than people think and older than it looks, and the distance between those two facts is one of the strangest survivals on any Irish table. So tonight, we are going to take this pot apart. The fire under it, the scraps inside it, the slow trick in its name, the bread beside it, and the single ingredient that quietly proves the whole legend wrong. Let me start with the hardest part of feeding a family in old Dublin, because everything about Coddle is an answer to it. A labourer in the Liberties, the crowded working districts west of Dublin Castle, came home with almost nothing. Coal and wood were not free. Meat was a luxury bought in scraps, not joints. A family might have 5 or 8 mouths in 2 rooms, and that meal had to land on the table every single night, not as a treat, but as survival. The question was brutally simple. How do you feed all of those people, hot, on the money and the fuel you do not have? Coddle is the answer, built one layer at a time, and the first layer is the fire. Watch what is missing under that pot. There is no roaring blaze. A Dublin family could not afford to feed a big fire all evening just to cook supper. So Coddle was designed around the smallest possible heat. One pot, set over embers or a low flame, left mostly alone. That choice sounds like a limitation. It was actually the whole secret. Because a fierce fire wastes fuel and burns cheap food to ruin. A low patient heat does the opposite. It asks for almost nothing and gives you hours of slow cooking for the price of a handful of coal. The pot did the work while the family did everything else. But a gentle fire creates its own problem. A low heat cannot fry. It cannot roast. It cannot crisp a sausage or render a hard cut of meat the way a hot pan does. And the meat a poor Dublin family could actually buy was exactly the hard, cheap, awkward stuff that needs real heat to become tender. So the low fire solved the fuel problem and handed you a meat problem. Solving that is the second layer, and it is the layer hiding inside the dish's own name. Here is a detail almost nobody who eats Coddle knows. The word itself is an instruction. Coddle comes from the old French word caudle, which meant to boil something gently, just under a true boil. The same root sat behind a warm, soothing drink once given to the sick, something simmered soft and easy on the body. Somewhere along the way the word crossed into English kitchens and settled into one precise meaning. To coddle is to cook in water, slowly, at a heat that never quite reaches a hard boil. That is not a quaint old name. It is the engineering of the dish. Think about what a long, gentle simmer does to the worst cuts of meat. The fatty bacon ends, the cheap sausages, the bits a butcher could barely sell. Hard connective tissue that would stay like rope in a hot pan slowly breaks down in warm water and turns to softness. Fat melts out and thickens the liquid around it. The very thing the low fire could not do by frying, the slow simmer does by patience. So now the cheap meat works. The fire stays small, the water stays warm, and over a few unhurried hours the scraps become tender and the broth turns rich. The poverty cut has been beaten, not with skill, not with money, but with time. And that raises the next problem. Tender meat is good. But a few sausage ends and a strip of bacon will not feed 8 people. You need to make almost nothing stretch into a full pot. That is the third layer, and it is the one that turned coddle from a recipe into a way of life. Coddle was rarely a planned dish with a shopping list. It was the opposite. It was the dish you made from what was already there. The classic version was a Saturday night meal cooked at the end of the week from the week's leftovers. The sausages that did not get eaten, the bacon rashers gone slightly past their best, the onions in the bottom of the basket. Nothing was bought specially. Everything that survived the week went into the pot, and the pot turned the leftovers of 7 days into one warm meal. That is the whole genius of it. Coddle is a leftovers machine. A family living on the edge could not afford to waste a single scrap of meat or fat, and Coddle made sure they never did. The week's odds and ends, which on their own were not a meal and not even enough for one person, became a supper for the whole household once the pot pulled them together. I want you to hold that idea against your own kitchen for a second, because the gap is enormous. Across Ireland and most of the wealthy world today, something close to 1/3 of all the food we buy ends up thrown away. The average household quietly bins hundreds of euros of food a year. The sausage ends, the tired vegetables, the bits past their best. Exactly the things a Dublin family in 1790 would have guarded like money, because to them it was. Coddle was a zero-waste design 2 centuries before anyone needed the phrase. They did not do it to be virtuous. They did it because the alternative was going hungry. So we have a pot that runs on almost no fuel, makes cheap meat tender, and turns a week of scraps into supper. There is one layer left in the build, and it is the one that makes it filling enough to send a working body to bed satisfied. That is the potatoes and the onions. And it is also where this whole story turns over and shows its other face. Drop the potatoes and onions into the warm pot and 2 things happen. The onion melts down and sweetens the broth, taking the rawness out of the cheap meat. The potatoes do the heavy lifting. As they soften, their starch leaks into the liquid and thickens it, and a thin, watery scrap stew becomes something dense enough to fill a stomach. Cheap, filling, and almost free. The poor family's pot is complete. But look hard at that potato, because it is the thread that unravels the legend we started with. The potato is not an old world food. It is not European at all. It came from the Andes, from South America, and it only arrived in Ireland in the late 1500s. The Middle Ages, the actual medieval period, had already been over for roughly a century before the first potato was ever planted in Irish soil. Sit with what that means. A dish whose entire body is built around the potato cannot possibly be medieval. It is structurally impossible. And the written record agrees. The first solid references to coddle as a Dublin dish come from the 1700s, the age of the early famines, when anything to hand save your nearest and dearest went into the pot. Not the year 1000, the 1700s. Coddle is a Georgian dish wearing a medieval costume. So why does everyone, including plenty of Irish people, swear it is ancient? Because the method is ancient, even though the ingredients are not. Long before the potato, before coddle had a name, the medieval Irish kitchen already ran on exactly this logic. One pot, a low fire, cheap or foraged scraps, and a long gentle simmer. The medieval staple across Britain and Ireland was pottage, a thick-simmered pot of grains, oats, onions, and whatever meat or greens a family could get. Oats, not potatoes, were the thing that thickened it and filled you up. Coddle is what happened when that medieval pot met the New World. The technique stayed exactly the same for 1,000 years. the low fire, the gentle coddling simmer, the leftovers logic, the bread on the side. Only one ingredient swapped in. The oats stepped aside, the potato stepped in, and the same ancient pot kept going under a new name. That is the answer to our opening question. Coddle is younger than people think because the potato is young, and it is older than it looks because the way you cook it is medieval to the core. That is the part worth carrying out of this video. When you eat coddle, you are not eating a medieval recipe. You are using a medieval method. None of this has to stay on a screen. The method survived, and people are making it again. And a pot of coddle was only ever half of supper anyway. The other half was the bread you tore into it, to mop the pale broth off the bottom of the bowl, the same way the simmered pot has been eaten in these islands since the Middle Ages. If you want to bake that other half of the meal, instead of just watching it, that is what the Medieval Bakery Collection is for. The Practical Recipes book walks you through the loaves themselves. The sourdough manual is for building and keeping a living leaven the way these bakers did. And the sourcing guide tells you where to find the right heritage grain. It is all over at the Medieval Way store. By the early 1800s, that bread and that pot had hardened into the fixed Saturday ritual of working Dublin, and that ritual is the reason coddle is still here at all. Most poverty food dies the moment people stop being poor. It carries the memory of going without, and families are glad to leave it behind. Coddle did the opposite. It climbed. Through the 1800s and into the 20th century, coddle stopped being only what you ate because you had to, and became what you ate because it was home. It was tied to a specific place, the working class heart of Dublin, and to a specific rhythm, the end of the week. It became a marker of being a real Dubliner, the taste of a particular street and a particular Saturday. You can measure that climb in who claimed it. Coddle worked its way into the writing of the city. James Joyce, the great chronicler of Dublin, lets it surface in his work, including a small folded phrase, in Finnegan's wake, cuddle his coddle. The playwright Sayano Casey is remembered as a lover of the dish. There is even a long-running story that Jonathan Swift, the man who wrote Gulliver's Travels, was fond of it, though that one lives in legend more than in any record, so treat it as a fond rumour rather than a fact. Coddle also travelled. When Dubliners left for Liverpool, for Boston, for anywhere the work was, the pot went with them in memory. A dish that needs no special ingredient and no written recipe is the easiest thing in the world to carry across an ocean. You just need a low fire and whatever the new country's butcher throws out cheap. So coddle quietly seeded itself wherever the Dublin poor landed, and it came home again every time someone returned. That portability is part of why it never died. It was never tied to one shop or one region's crop. It was tied to a method, and a method fits in your hands. And every St. Patrick's season, kitchens that have not made it in years put a pot back on, half out of hunger and half out of memory. Here is the strangest survival detail of all. For something like 200 years, coddle existed almost entirely by word of mouth. It was passed from mother to daughter, cooked by feel, never written down. The first proper printed recipe for Dublin coddle did not appear until a cookbook in 1958. Think about that. A dish kept alive for 2 centuries with no written instructions, carried purely in the hands and memory of ordinary Dublin families. That is not a recipe that was preserved. That is a recipe that was lived. And it is still being lived. Walk into the right Dublin home today, and a pot of coddle still goes on, still on a Saturday, still pale, still made from whatever the week left behind. Which brings us to the thing this whole video has been quietly building toward. You can make it too. Tonight if you want. You do not need a recipe card, because coddle was never really about one. It is about the method, and you already understand the method now because we just took it apart. Start with the cheap meat, the way they did. Sausages and a few rashers of bacon, the fattier the better. Old Dublin would not have browned them, and that is why a true coddle looks pale, almost grey, instead of the deep brown of a roasted stew. If the pale look bothers you, a light browning is allowed, but know that you are stepping away from the honest version when you do it. Lay the meat in the bottom of a heavy pot. Then build the layers you have already met. Thickly sliced onions for sweetness in the broth. Potatoes in big chunks for the starch that thickens everything and fills you up. Season it simply, salt and pepper, maybe a bay leaf. Then pour in just enough water, or a little stock if you have it, to almost cover everything and bring it up to that one critical temperature. A bare simmer, never a hard rolling boil. Remember the word. To coddle is to cook gently. The whole dish lives or dies on keeping the heat low and the patience high. Then you leave it. An hour, 2 hours, longer if you like, on that low heat, while the cheap cuts go tender and the potatoes melt at their edges and quietly thicken the pot. Tear some bread to eat alongside it. That is coddle. No technique, no expensive cut, no skill beyond the willingness to wait. And it gets better the second day. Like most slow-simmered pots, a coddle reheated the next evening is deeper and richer than the night you made it, because the flavours keep marrying in the cold. The poor family that made it on Saturday was not only feeding tonight, they were setting up an even better meal for tomorrow out of the very same pot. Nothing bought, nothing wasted, 2 suppers from one fire. That is the lesson the modern kitchen keeps relearning the expensive way. We throw away a third of our food and call slow cooking a trend. A Dublin family in a 2-room flat, 200 years ago, with a few sausage ends and a low fire, already knew the whole answer. They just called it Saturday. So the next time someone hands you a bowl of pale stew and tells you it is medieval, you will know the real story. The potato in it is from the wrong century. But the pot it cooked in, the gentle fire, the patient simmer, the refusal to waste a scrap, all of that really is 1,000 years old. Coddle is the Middle Ages in disguise, and the disguise is a vegetable from Peru. We dig up the knowledge the modern world walked past. Still cook this? Tell me below, with the potato or your grandmother's way. Subscribe and stay curious.